Well, today's topic is the missing intro of the defer block. So on this talk, I basically just go into a little bit more details on why do we even need that, or how does it help, and how we, let's say, could do that thing before what, of course, defer does now. So short intro, I'm Enea Halari based in Albania. I'm a software engineer at pushbase.io. I'm also a GD for Angular. I'm a co-creator of ng extension library together with Chao. And what I mostly do is large migrations on Angular, of course, performance improvements, and lately also scalable Angular architectures. Well, let's continue. Loading what matters first, viewport. So let's say we have an application, like a movies application. And if we zoom out, most of the time we can see, for example, the details part, like picture, title, some description, the cast. And of course, below that, we can probably see some recommended movies or, let's say, related movies. And most of the time, what we see on our browser initially is the viewport, so only the first part. But the way we write code is mostly just show everything in one place. And of course, we also would have the recommended movies, which for the user, they would be out of viewport. And of course, that makes it a great candidate for lazy loading. So to just load it slightly later instead of like initially loaded. So manual lazy loading. In order to lazy load in Angular, we can, let's say, just do normal dynamic imports using import and create them using, let's say, create component or pass them to ng component outlet, which basically uses the same API under the hood. So let's go with view container f.create component. So lazy loading a component. How it looks on code. So let's say we have some movie lists, like those recommendations or recommended results. And in order to lazy load it, what we need to do first is, of course, not load that thing immediately on the template. Otherwise, it becomes, let's say, it would be bundled with the same, let's say, movies page details that movie details page component. And what we do is, instead of loading the component directly, we just create a, let's say, a div element. And of course, we put a template reference to it. And of course, that would, let's say, serve as an anchor. And in order to get that, we just do view child on movie list reference. And what we do there is we say read the view container ref. So we just get the container ref of that element. And in order to lazy load some code, what we can do is, as I said before, is just say import this chunk and then call create component. Of course, there we pass the movie list that we got from the, let's say, dynamic import, and of course, apply some inputs like component ref instance.movies, and we pass the, let's say, the inputs as we did before on the template. And of course, what that will do is create a new chunk when we, let's say, load our page. But sometimes we also need a loading template to show something while that component is, let's say, being loaded. And for that, what we can do is we can say create an ng template, and of course, grab it using viewchild again. We also need error handling. So if, let's say, the loading fails, we need to show something, and we can use the same logic for the error part. And what we can do is inside, like before we do the import and let's say the component creation, we can first say create embedded view. And there we pass the loading template. And this, of course, will, let's say, load the loading template. And after that, it will load the lazy component. But also what we can do is, of course, render the error template on the catch part. Great. Now let's load the component when it reaches the viewport. And in order to do that, of course, I want to bring to your attention the part that we have a viewport and out of viewport. And in order to know when something reaches viewport, we can use something called intersection observer API, which is, let's say, widely available, as we can see on the baseline banner here. And what we want to do basically is listen if an element reaches viewport, and after that just unsubscribe, because we already, let's say, get the trigger that the component needs to be loaded. So in order to do that, what we can say is we can say create an observer, like new intersection observer. And then the moment that, let's say, it runs and it, let's say, fetches, or let's say is getting triggered, what we do is we unobserve. So this, think of it like a take one on ArcGIS operators. And after that, we run some logic when the element is visible in the viewport. And of course, just like subscribe for ArcGIS, we need to call observe and pass an element to it. And this, of course, will initialize observing the element. And what we can do now is we take all the logic that we had before and put it inside that logic part here. So basically now we have observer, intersection observer, and then observer and observe, and then start the observer here. And all the code of, let's say, loading, of creating the loading template, loading the lazy component and the error template, now it's inside that template. So inside that code block. And if we look at the complete code, it looks something like this. It's like too much code, and you need to understand how, view container ref works, how template ref works, how intersection observer works. You need to understand that you also need to unobserve, and of course, also clear the view container before creating something. And of course, all that logic, which is too much if you're just getting started. So basically, we have to connect all this, let's say, arrows ourselves on the template. Like a div for an anchor, we need to connect the loading template, we need to connect the error template. And as I said before, that's too much code. And let's say defer block is the rescue for it. So when it comes to defer, what we can do is, instead of doing all that other stuff, we can say movie list and movie list, and we can say just put it inside the defer block. And that's it. We need loading, of course. And that's it. We just put loading. Second, I need to got the phone. And of course, after loading, we can also show error when the, let's say, the component loading fails. We also had the case where we need to show something on viewport, and that's where on viewport comes into place. Like, it's a trigger for defer blocks, and we can do that using that div. So we can just create that same reference, and when that div comes into the viewport, we basically go and load the component. So here is a before and after. Isn't that great? Well, I think so. So how does it work? Under the hood, what Angular does is basically creates IV instructions, and for the defer components, it basically creates those, let's say, dynamic imports. And of course, loads them based on the, let's say, triggers. So this is a code generated by the Angular compiler. And I have to say that defer blocks only works with Angular standalone components, directives, and pipes. It doesn't work, for example, with normal HTML tags. Defer triggers. Well, defer accepts 3 types of triggers: when, on, and prefetch, and we will go into details for each one of them. So when trigger accepts expression that returns a Boolean. For example, we want to, let's say, load the movie list when the movies are loaded, and we want to show the recommended movies. So based on some, I don't know, flags that is coming from the backend. But also, we have to take into account that defer with when is not the same as if. So here we have defer when movies loaded and if show recommended. If show recommended, or if movies loaded, let's say, gets changed from movies loaded to false, this component will still show. So take that into account. So we shouldn't use, let's say, defer with when trigger the same as if it was an if, let's say, condition. Okay, so on trigger accepts multiple configurable options, and the first one is idle. And what it does under the hood is basically it calls request idle callback. So when there's nothing happening on the site anymore, like no more asynchronous operations, that's when this defer block will load. Interaction, we can use it with, let's say, basically it will interact to click and key down. So when we click on that placeholder component or image or whatever thing we have inside there, then that's when the app video player will, let's say, be loaded. Or what we can do is we can also pass a reference there. So we can have a button from, let's say, somewhere else in the template and be like, we want to, let's say, load this menu login form when we go and let's say click on the login button reference. So we can lazy load some model component or forms when let's say we interact with some, let's say, specific buttons or inputs. Immediate is basically immediately after render. So it just same as we had on that let's say manual lazy loading, where we just say on after viewing it, just load component and render it. We have a timer. Timer uses set timeout under the hood, so we can just put 100 milliseconds there, or just like normal 1 second. And it will just say after 1 second, just load it. And then we have hover. And same as, let's say, interaction, it uses mouse enter and focus in. And of course, what we can say is we can just say hover on the placeholder or hover on some element reference that we passed to it. So it can be a button, a div, a span, another component, doesn't matter. As long as the user will hover on it, then that, let's say, video editor component will load. And then we have viewport, and that's exactly the same use case as we had before. So we can either say placeholder, like when this div comes into the viewport, then we load the footer. Or we can also say when the contact form, let's say, comes into the viewport, then we load the footer. This way, we can say the moment that the user is scrolling before he reaches the footer, which only, for example, can have like just a copyrights div, we can say the moment that it reaches the contact form, then just go and also load the footer, because we know that the user will scroll also below. And that's a great way to, let's say, think about the viewport, for example, or the movie details. So then we have prefetch. Prefetch basically accepts everything that when an on triggers, let's say, happens. And what prefetch does is basically say, just go and load the, let's say, the JavaScript for it, but not the component directly. So we can say prefetch when movie is loaded, prefetch on timer, prefetch on hover, prefetch on interaction. And of course, we can use all options at once, meaning like we can use when movies loaded, on a timer, or on hover, and prefetch on interaction or on viewport. This is not recommended, but I just showed you there that you can do it. So it's not blocking you from combining multiple things at once. There's more. There's placeholder that has, let's say, its minimum params. Loading has after and minimum, and error, of course, doesn't have any params. But that's deferred for another time. Well, how to break defer? It's easy. You just create a, let's say, normal application like ng-new. You do ng-serve, and you'll see that defer won't be treated the same as, let's say, as we saw here, because by default on Angular, I think v19, we use HMR. And HMR basically kills the defer functionality. Only on development, I have to say. So if you're in development mode, you'll see that defer blocks will be loaded immediately instead of, let's say, playing by the rules of defer block. But when you deploy to production, you will have normal, of course, defer behavior. So basically what will happen, I think, in Angular v20 is that you'll see a warning on your browser console saying that Angular has detected that this application contains defer blocks and the hot module replacement mode is enabled. And of course, all defer block dependencies will be loaded eagerly. So another way to break it is to use the component outside the defer block. If we have the same movie list in the same, let's say, template, and we have an if clause there. And of course, we have the defer here because this movie list is also, let's say, outside the defer block. This thing here will be loaded eagerly. And of course, that breaks the whole idea of defer lazy loading a component. So keep that in mind. So if you don't see, let's say, a component lazy loaded, you probably will have some, let's say, other component outside defer block inside your template. You probably maybe are using viewchild or viewchildren and are taking a reference of that, for example, count component, even though you are lazy loading it on your, let's say, component. And what this does is basically still retains that count component reference. And this will also break your defer. What else? As I said before, defer doesn't work if the component or directive or pipe is not standalone. But you can say that, hey, I have a count component, it is standalone. I import it on a module, export it on a module, and then on the app component, I import the count module. That thing basically won't work. So in order for defer to work, you need to import the count component here directly in order for it to, let's say, be lazy loaded. How to optimize? Well, if you use defer inside for loops, you can say, hey, I want to, let's say, defer load the movie card. And then we have a for loop and defer inside of it. And what happens is that for loop for each element will create an embedded view. And of course, because we have the defer block, which also creates its own, let's say, embedded views, now we are creating twice as much. So for each embedded view, we are now creating another one. That's not great. One way to solve this is basically to just move the defer block outside. And what this will do is we'll create one embedded view for the defer block. And of course, how many movies we have on that for loop. And that's how many embedded views it will create. So this is basically the better behavior, I have to say. Well, incremental hydration. I won't talk more about it, but if you want to learn more, basically defer is the building block for incremental hydration. And Michael, who is a CEO at Pushbase, has a talk on incremental hydration in Angular. And I also put the link there for you to just check it out. It's really well explained and it really goes into, let's say, details and in depth. Highly recommended. Well, that's all, folks. I'm Anaya, and let's discuss defer.
All right, Anaya, thank you very much for the presentation. That was really interesting to take a look at defer from slightly different angle and also to have a little bit more of a look under the hood. So yeah, now it's time for our Q&A session. So guys, please be sure to ask your questions into the chat. So let's have a look if there is anything already there. Seems not yet. Let's wait another second or two. Some words of appreciation.
Maybe the slides were good.
Yeah, I think so, to be honest. Okay, there is one question from Wojciech Trawiński. How to make a reload when there is an error when using defer?
There's not a way to do that, I think. And that's a good, I think, that would be a great issue on the Angular GitHub.
Okay, so
I never had issues, to be honest.
Yeah, but it could happen potentially, right? So Wojciech, you are welcome to open an issue or maybe even a PR. So let's get to the next one. When using defer, it has some impact or bad side effect with SSR?
Well, if you use defer without the hydrate, let's say, trigger, what you're doing is basically defer loading that component, and it won't load on the SSR. But if you use the hydrate trigger, basically that component will also load on the server side, and you'll have, let's say, a better story with it on the client. So I'd say use defer without hydrate if you only need to, let's say, defer load something. But if not, then probably it's not good to use it, because if you use it, for example, on things that are basically on your initial viewport, then you probably may cause some CLS because you're loading content late, even though you need to load it immediately.
All right. Thank you for that. And one more, can we pass functions as param?
Well, I don't get that question. You mean function, we can call them when inside the when or on the on trigger, but we cannot say conditional when or on. We can just use both, maybe.
Mm-hmm. So I guess that was the question. So yeah, hopefully you answered it. And that would be it. That's the end of our Q&A session. So again, Enea, thank you very much for joining us today. We were really happy to have you with us. And
Happy to be here.
Yeah, that's great to hear. And take care and see you at some future events. Bye.
See you. Bye-bye.